Good morning and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. My name is Daniel Vincent here with my co host Sean Cheatham. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you would like to support us financially, we would greatly appreciate it. You can do so at patreon.com/the particular Baptist. You can do a custom gift, or you can subscribe to one of the three tiers that we have there. And we want to thank our current subscribers for their continued support and your support of our ministry financially. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sean. We're going to be talking about particular Baptist history today, but Sean wanted to clarify something from a previous episode before we get started. So I'll hand it off to him.
So I wanted to go back to some of the things we said in the episode on self-defense, biblical self-defense. And specifically, the way I spoke about the shooting that happened in the Christian school, I think was wrong, and that it suggested that it would be okay to stand by while if the shooter was there for religious persecution reasons or religious reasons, that it would have been okay to stand by, and I don't think that's correct. That's wrong. And specifically, why I say this is because I set up the scenario that, could you really interview the person about why they were there? Well, no, you can't. So you should just take them out, implying that if I was able to interview them and they were there for religious persecution, that I would stand by. So just to go into why I think that that's wrong. Even if they were there for some sort of religious persecution reason, I don't think it would have been right to stand by and not defend the defenseless. Lawless criminals seeking to murder, which even by our own government standard, that's wrong. That's not the same thing as religious persecution by a government. And then I want to quote a little bit from Nehemiah here, sort of to illustrate my point. So I'll do Nehemiah 4 verses 7 and 8. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth and conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. And then going to verse 13 and 14 here, Nehemiah speaking, therefore said I in the lower places behind the wall and on the higher places, I even set the people after their families with their swords and their spears and their bows. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not ye afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses. So it might not immediately be obvious, but there's both, I would say, lawless criminals and government actors here. Sanballat is actually the governor of Samaria that's conspiring against the Jews here. But you also have like the Arabians and the Ammonites, and they're all coming together to attack the Israelites in something that's religious, right? They've been commanded by God to build this wall, so that's what they're doing. It's a religious service, and Nehemiah says, like, take up your swords and be prepared to defend your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So I think we have a good biblical precedent here for saying that, okay, even if it is even if it's for religious persecution reasons, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to just lay down and take it. And I would view that there is a difference between a state actor and a lawless criminal in how that we think about it, but there's not a substantial difference. There are cases where it's absolutely appropriate to use self-defense against a state actor, even if it does have a religious element to it, as we just saw there. Now, I do want to leave open the possibility that a martyr might feel that it was appropriate for them not to resist and lay down their life. And that's in both the context of government religious persecution and lawless criminals. I'm not going to make a distinction there. If it's if somebody thinks that this is the correct decision to do for their witness to Christ and the gospel, then I would not want to discourage them from doing that. But a lot of this would probably be contextual, and the person would need to determine what was best in their situation. So I don't necessarily want to put out a cookie cutter solution to all these things. It should be left up to the individual on what they think is best in their witness to Christ. Um, and then just a couple more arguments about why I think the way we do. Um, by engaging in defense, specifically talking about the context of the school shooting, we are actually upholding the law of the land. We're fulfilling the government mandate to protect the innocent. And I want to be clear that this is an additional reason. It's not the only reason, because obviously the government could come in and say that, well, you don't have the right to do that. But that just because the government says it or not doesn't mean that we wouldn't have the right to do it. We would still be right to intervene. Um, while it's normative that the government is the one that puts people to death, I don't think it's exclusively the case. Genesis 9:6 says that if man is engaged in bloodshed, their blood should be spilt by man. We do see from the rest of the Bible that it's at least normative, that it's the state that does the putting to death, but I wouldn't say that it's exclusive um, to the government. You do have the case with Abraham and Lot, where the king of the area has actually kidnapped Lot, and Abraham and his men go and kill the people that took Lot. So it's clear, and this is not condemned anywhere by the Bible. It's actually seemed to be it's upheld as a good thing. So we see that it's appropriate sometimes for men to engage in that, even if the government is it's not the government as the actor who's doing it. Proverbs 24:11 and 12 indicate that we should be ready to protect the innocent. Verse 11, if thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death, and those that are ready to be slain, if thou sayest, behold, we knew it not, doth not he that pondereth the heart consider it? And he that keepeth thy soul, doth not he know it? And shall he not render to every man according to his works? So I think that's fairly straightforward. We're supposed to protect those going to their death, and obviously the school shooting, I think, would fit that. Another example where I think that even in the administration of Christian duties, it's perfectly okay to act in self-defense is, and we did bring this up, I think, in the original podcast. Luke 22 verses 36 through 38. This is Jesus speaking, that he said unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say unto you that this is written, that is written must yet be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors for the things concerning me. And they said, Lord, behold, here are two swords. And he said unto them, it is enough. So originally, Christ sent the disciples out to preach the gospel and told them to take no bag. And I don't think they mentioned sword, but I think they weren't taking swords. But now he's saying that you will take a bag with your swords and swords. So if in the original context it was in the administration of their duties as apostles, it makes sense that okay, you're taking your sword now for protection in your duties as an apostle, to protect yourself from lawless haters of the message. Now we don't want to be offensive like Peter ultimately takes it with his sword, chopping off the ear of someone. But at the very least, I think it's reasonable to be defensive with it. I do want to say that there is also a special duty for those that are older to protect children. And when I say that, I don't mean that there's not a duty to protect others also, just that there's a special duty to protect children. And I think in the original video, I conflated martyrdom with self-defense when I was talking about it in that context. So I want to draw that out and make a clear distinction that and I did say this part in the podcast, that when you're submitting to martyrdom, it's something that's directed towards oneself. I don't see martyrdom as being as involving you standing by while other people are being killed. Martyrdom is it's self-focused. You're laying down purposely your life for Christ. And the fact that there are other people around might give the indication that like maybe it's really not a martyrdom situation. But anyway, just to close on all this, I think it's a good way to think about it is in these situations you're choosing between which life you're going to protect or keep, the innocent or the guilty. So in the case of the school shooting, if you take out the man, then you're taking out the man and saving the lives of the innocent. But if you don't, you're protecting his life, and the innocent are actually the ones that are suffering, and that's not right. Um, while in a martyrdom situation, I might give up my life for the cause of Christ. In the situation where other lives are at stake, I should prioritize the life. I shouldn't prioritize the life of the guilty man over the lives of the innocent, which is what I would be doing if I stood by. So I wanted to make that correction because obviously that's a pretty big deal, and I didn't want people to come off with the wrong idea and maybe hesitate in a situation where they actually should be willing to stand up immediately and take action. So I wanted to offer that correction there.
Thank you, Sean. And I was Sean and I talked last night about this, and we've been kind of sort of kicking this around um, a little bit in terms of how to how do we work through this issue. After hearing Sean explain it that way, because I wasn't really um, I guess kind of on board with that. Not that I'm disagreeing with him. I guess I'm just trying to work out the the implications of it. But after Sean explained it today, I think I'm much more on that side. Still need to think through it a little bit more, but that sounds right to me. But I think it's good that we clarify. I know we're talking about a different topic today than this, but I think it's good that we clarify these things because we want to stay humble. If we have things that we need to go back and correct that we feel we need to correct, we should be able to do that and address these things. We want to be, as Christians, we're to speak truth, and we want to speak as clearly and consistently as we can. And if we mess up or feel like we've messed up, we need to go back and correct it. So, I hope that this is, it's helpful that we do that. And feel free to, bring any feedback on these things. If you have any further things, feel free to point out issues that you see that we might have in our podcast, and we can look at them and address them if needed. But hopefully that's been helpful. Thank you, Sean.
Absolutely.
All right. So diving into our topic this morning, so we're going to be talking about particular Baptist history. So we're gonna be doing the slide deck today. I'll pull it up here. And for those listening on the audio, sorry you're not going to be able to see, but hopefully we'll try to, as we go along, we'll try to communicate as much as we can so that it's you can follow along while you're listening. But we're going to be talking about particular Baptist persecution today. So we had Charles III coronated, I think last week. And it kind of, I guess, got Sean and I thinking about the particular Baptists because the particular Baptists were around the time of the two previous Charleses in England, Charles I and Charles II. So this seemed like a really good time to talk about our particular Baptist forefathers, particularly the persecution that was under those two governments. And also even some of the times that they thrived in religious toleration. So it kind of worked out in that way. It's not meant to be a jab at the new king, but it provides a good opportunity to talk about this is real history. England has a thorny history. It just does, and these are things that that we can talk about and discuss. I think in a respectful way, even to the new king, without being flippant about it. But so we're going to talk about that today. Just some sources, as we're going through this through historical presentations. I think it's good to present your sources, or at least the main ones that you use. So at least from my side, I lean heavily on the Renahans for this. So Jim Renahan, Sam Renahan, Edification and Beauty by Jim Renahan, For the Vindication of the Truth by Jim Renahan, the Petty France Church Parts 1 and 2 by Samuel Renahan, Samuel Renahan's blog, I think it's just called the Petty France Church or something like that. Various sites for different pictures in the slideshow. Michael Hyken's Kiffin, Knowles, and Keach book, royal.uk, Anabaptist Mennonite Network website, Christian History Institute site, and Britannica Encyclopedia site. So those were, most, if not all, of my source material that I pulled from this. I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add, Sean. source wise?
No, like, I mean, I looked at the Wikipedia articles for like the Solemn League and Covenant and such,
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah,
Yeah, that's fine.
nothing like a formal citation.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. Yeah, that way, people can't come back because there are some people that will float around out there like, you plagiarize this, you plagiarize that. It just keeps us, all above reproach in that regard. All right, so let's dive right in. So, really, the goal of what we're wanting to get to here with particular Baptist persecution is what are the lessons that were learned from, looking at our particular Baptist history. So, we're going to do a high level overview of some of the persecution and the church life and some of the political context surrounding the particular Baptists at in the 17th century, or at least the early to mid late 17th century, and then look at some biblical application from that. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in. So early particular Baptists. So the early particular Baptists really came on the scene in a big way with the presentation of their first confession of faith in 1646. This is the first London Baptist Confession of Faith, which is given to Parliament. So they had to present who they were, or what their beliefs were at least, to Parliament, and this was how they did that, formally speaking. And they were a nonconformist group, meaning that they were not part of the Church of England. They didn't conform to the Church of England. They were their own group, although they saw themselves as agreeing with a lot of their Presbyterian and Anglican brethren, but they did not agree in key areas. They also had to distinguish themselves as not being Anabaptists, because they were called Anabaptists early on. They were associated with that group because of the Munster incident. Munster was a very traumatizing incident for Europe, and Munster's in Germany. This is where a group of Anabaptists, and there are different strains of Anabaptists, so you have to be careful not to lump them all together, just in the same way that the uh, the Reformed lumped the particular Baptists in with the Anabaptists, and some do that today. But we have to be careful not to do that. But this was a particular offshoot of Anabaptists that were headed by Jan Mathis. He was just a baker. He was a baker. He was nobody important, but he got it in his head um, that the New Jerusalem would be established in Munster and not in Strasbourg as originally thought. So this actually led to literally thousands of people descending upon Munster, because they thought this is, the end of the world was coming. This is where the New Jerusalem would be established, was in Munster. So we all got to convene in Munster. The world would be destroyed. The rest of the world would be destroyed. We got to convene in Munster. And so they went there. And then the Roman Catholic bishop there actually had an army that tried to siege Munster. He tried to take it back. And then, inside there was this purging of the city, killing of all dissenters. Or they tried to anyways, but they ended up exploiting or pushing out dissenters from Munster. Mathis was convinced to not kill them. This would not be a good look for them. So let's just get rid of them out of the city. Let's not actually, kill them. That would not be a good idea. But this did not, stop any siege from happening in the city. The Roman Catholic bishop there sought to take the city back. But meanwhile, inside, all books but scripture were burned. And then some men tried to attack the local bishop's army head on. Including Mathis. He was killed, and I think it said he was also beheaded. And then there was a successor to Mathis, Jan van Leyden. He picked up where Mathis left off, but he really lived a hedonistic lifestyle, established polygamy within Munster, is running naked through the city, just a crazy man. And then in May 25th, 1545, the army broke through Munster and really provided justice to to what was going on. They killed many of them. Some were captured. And so this incident left a huge stench in the nostrils of Europe in general. So when these Baptists come along and they're saying, well, we don't believe in infant baptism. We believe that you do need, your infant baptism is not legitimate. You need to be rebaptized. in order to upon a profession of faith. And there's these other views that they have. It's easy to see why they would have been considered Anabaptists. Oh, this is just another version of Anabaptism, and they need to be suppressed. And so in the title of the Confession of Faith, the 1646, they actually had to specifically say that they were falsely called Anabaptists. So it's in the title because they were so stigmatized in this way that they had to clarify who they were. These people were not, they were not part of the Anabaptists. We have specific theological distinctives that prevent us from falling into that category. And so that the Munster incident would just would make it very difficult for the particular Baptist reputation. But after they pushed through and got their confession set up, it didn't take long for the blowback to start. Okay, you had some physical persecution at first, but not primarily. You had Benjamin Cox, who was he was a Anglican minister who became a particular Baptist, and he was arrested for passing out copies of the First London Baptist Confession of Faith outside the House of Commons. So he just put himself right in the situation where he would be physically persecuted. A guy who's thought to be an Anabaptist, associated with an Anabaptist group, right at Parliament's doorstep. That's going to get you in trouble right away. So he was arrested, but primarily you see written persecution. You see written persecution primarily in this way. Okay, so you see that there's two men in particular that write. Thomas Edwards, not to be confused with, I don't think he has any associated with Jonathan Edwards, but Thomas Edwards was a Presbyterian who was kind of one of those heresy hunter kind of guys who was very colorful with his language. And then you had Daniel Featley, who was part of the Westminster Assembly, who they both wrote against the particular Baptists. These Baptists, they weren't fitting the main Reform mold as taught by those in the high places and Orthodox theological positions. But here's a little taste of kind of what they wrote. This is Featley writing about the particular Baptists as it relates to their confession of faith. He said, quote, "They cover a little rat's bane, or rat poison, in a great quantity of sugar, that it may not be discerned. For among the 53 articles of their confession, there are not above 6, but may pass with a fair construction. And in those 6, none of the foulest and most odious positions wherewith that sect is aspersed are expressed." So it seems that he's saying that, they're probably not, it almost sounds like he's saying they're not being very honest with how they're presenting their position. He's saying they're hiding rat's poison in a great quantity of sugar. So they're disguising, their positions by looking as good as they can. Although he does say that, there are some things that are orthodox that they teach. And I think when he says sect, I think he's talking about the Anabaptists. So he does acknowledge that there is, they're orthodox in some way, but overall they're hot garbage. So, that writing back then, people were very colorful with their language. So you do see pushback pretty quickly. And then looking at some of the broader historical context, you see Charles I. If you look at the slide there, the painting in the background there is of Charles I. He was king at this point, but the country was far from stable. You had civil war that had broken out. The king was unpopular. So when Parliament convened to discuss, like the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Westminster Assembly, the country was not in a good place at this time. The very year the First London Baptist Confession of Faith was published and provided to Parliament, you had the king handing himself over to the Scots, who then handed him over to Parliament. And then soon after, in 1648, you had another civil war started. You had Oliver Cromwell coming on the scene and gaining victory, okay, and establishing really kind of a republic, I guess, in abolishing the monarchy. And then you have Parliament, who was not in control. The army really made decisions as it regards to Charles' fate. And then Charles was ultimately executed. He was beheaded with with the unpopularity that he had. He was executed on January 30th, 1649, just 3 years after the Particular Baptists had presented their confession. So, as the Particular Baptists are coming on the scene in a big way, trying to make themselves credible in the eyes of the state has its own major internal problems to deal with the king being beheaded. So it almost seems like at this point you're going to have a time where it's going to be very difficult for them to establish themselves. And Sean, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Before I dive in, I do want to specify something. With the first London Baptist Confession of Faith, it was originally written in 1644, so you'll often see it associated with that date. But 1646 was the second edition, I believe, and that's the more polished version. So that's why we've got I think that's why we've got 1646 in the slides there. But anyway, so moving on. Where did this leave the Particular Baptists? With the removal of Charles I, the vacuum was filled by Oliver Cromwell, excuse me, and his comrades. The Particular Baptists found freedom to worship and practice under Cromwell. Cromwell was actually an independent, so he was more that mindset anyway. And even in his army, there were quite a few Baptists that were part of the army. Um, uh, but Cromwell died in 1658, leaving yet another vacuum of power. During Cromwell's reign, the Petty France Church was established seemingly in 1656. This means that the freedom afforded under Cromwell allowed Particular Baptists to become more established. The Petty France Church would be important for Particular Baptists down the road, with Benjamin Cox and his son Nehemiah coming into view. 2 years after Cromwell's death, the monarchy would be restored under Charles II, who also married a Roman Catholic and was quasi-Roman Catholic, with the Roman Church accepting him into their church at his deathbed. Charles II is an interesting case because his father was accused of being Roman Catholic, and he had a very big reason for not wanting to see him Roman Catholic. From what I've seen, I tend to lean that he probably was, but you can't definitively say. Although at the very least, he did on his deathbed accept being a member of the Roman Catholic Church. But he wouldn't be in power for a very long time. But with this change, there came persecution for all nonconformists. This was favored by the Anglicans, who did not appreciate dissent from a more nationalistic church. The Clarendon Codes that were also published at this time provided acts of punishment against those who did not conform to the state church, which would have included the independents, like the Particular Baptists. And just for a little bit of the Clarendon Codes, there was the Corporation Act, which prevented anyone not taking sacraments at a state church from holding any municipal office. The Act of Uniformity, which prevented church offices from being held by nonconformists. The Conventicle Act, and that made nonconformist worship illegal even in private houses under a certain condition. You had the 5 Mile Act. Nonconformist ministers could not visit or reside within 5 miles of any place that they enacted ministerial duties. So you have these things that are making it hard for the Particular Baptists during this time. And for about the next 30 years, you're going to see nonconformists under this persecution.
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of see this. That there are those today in England that they're not favorable towards a monarchy. It's not unprecedented that the monarchy was established. It was abolished for a time, for quite a while. Maybe
Yeah.
I think it was maybe at least 10 years. While Cromwell was in power, that was the case. And there was more of a republican type government established. But the king, Charles's son, was floating around out there exiled. So the monarchy, while in a formal sense was abolished, the players who were part of that system were not gone. They didn't kill them all off. So you still have Charles II coming back and starting to try to establish this monarchy again. But it is interesting to see that in England's history, you do have this symbolic system that was completely abolished for a time. It is very interesting. So even if England were to try and do that today, it wouldn't be unprecedented that it would be done. Um,
Yeah, I know there were people at the time that accused Cromwell of basically being a king, like that's how he was acting.
yeah,
Um, whether or not that's true, that's beyond the scope of the research I did. But regardless, like he didn't want to be a king. They did try to put his son in place afterwards, and it didn't work. And then you do have the restoration of Charles II. But yeah, there was at least a more democratic bent towards under his rulership.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's part of the reason you see the particular Baptist thriving so well is because of that. Um, is because of that. The monarchy is not trying to push a church system upon you, and Cromwell being an independent, he obviously is not going to be in line with the state church. Although if I remember correctly, I think he did try to establish some religious rules that were, to be enforced by government, but I could be wrong about that. But I seem
My
to recall that.
Yeah, my recollection is that it didn't matter who was in power of the Protestants, that Roman Catholics were always out. And I think that was the case under Cromwell. In fact, I know it has to be the case because Cromwell's armies in Ireland were still, I believe, trying to subdue the Catholic
That is
population.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes, they
Um,
actually killed many Roman
yeah.
Catholics there, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Yeah, Cromwell gets accused of war crimes, and from my understanding, there were actually war crimes committed in the campaigns in Ireland, but Cromwell was not personally leading the armies, so it's a little bit up in the air whether or not like he was aware of exactly what was going on. Obviously, if there were war crimes committed, we would repudiate that absolutely. But I know Roman Catholics like to completely bring down. Well, some Roman Catholic apologists like to completely bring down Cromwell, and I don't know that all that they say is quite fair about him.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we would agree with how he got into power, but
Yeah,
we
yeah.
wouldn't agree with that necessarily. But it's more that the good came in spite of what we would see as a problematic, method of getting into power. God worked mightily in the particular Baptists during this time, and they took advantage of the freedom that resulted in this, even if they may not have agreed how it got there. As we do see them starting to meet and starting to kind of try to establish themselves during Cromwell's rule. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last very long. I mean, we have more persecution coming on the scene. Jumping to another particular Baptist character, Edward Harrison. He was an early particular Baptist, and he was a member of the Petty France Church. This was a kind of a centralized, well-known church of particular Baptists at the time. When you had um, particular Baptists in different places, but I think this was kind of a central hub of particular Baptist life. And again, you had a pretty active time during Cromwell's rule with an associated meeting taking place in 1658 with particular Baptists, which included William Kiffin, who was a signer of the first London Baptist Convention and a signer of the second. And a pretty prominent figure in his own right. He was a merchant, very wealthy man, had a lot of influence. But they were trying to take advantage of the freedom they had, but it wouldn't last very long. When Cromwell passed away, Charles II returned. He returned in 1616, and then the Clarendon Codes were enacted, and the Petty France Church in London came under fire. It didn't take very long. I'm going to read a brief section from Sam Renahan's book, The Petty France Church Part 2, on page 107, 108. He says this, quote, on June 15th, 1662, soldiers disturbed the church in Petty France, badly wounding a young boy and incarcerated the unnamed preacher, likely Edward Harrison, in Newgate. On 29 June, they returned and broke the gallery of the church. Another spy report in 1664 named Benjamin Cox working together with Mr. Harrison, Edward Harrison, and Mr. Toll, Samuel Toll, end quote. So notice that this is only 2 years after Charles II comes back. So it in the implementation of the Clarendon Code. So you see very quickly that there's this push against nonconformists. They were serious about enforcing this law, enforcing the pushing out nonconformists, and so they did so with force. I mean, they were attacking children basically, and sending spies into the Petty France Church. So it's almost like something out of an espionage movie or something. But they were spying on the church. They were using force against the particular Baptists because they were not conforming to what the state said they should participate in worship. But it doesn't seem that the particular Baptists were undeterred. They kept going. They kept pushing. You see, Nehemiah Cox just 8 years later. This was Benjamin Cox's son. He would be imprisoned for preaching. Sam Renahan says in his Petty France Church Part 1, page 76, quote, Nehemiah was imprisoned for affirming that the Church of England was not a true church. And then Renahan even quotes some of the deposition against him, in gathering the evidence. It says, quote, and the said Nehemiah Cox did aver and say that the Church of England, as it now stands, is an anti-Christian church, and that this meeting at which they are now taken is the way of Christ and according to the word of God. And not much different than what we would probably say today about the Church of England, that it is not a true church. And there's a lot of unbiblical practices that are going on there. And especially you look at what's happening today with the acceptance of wicked lifestyles in the Anglican Church and the abandonment of, some of those core doctrines. Nehemiah Cox would probably have stronger words to say today
Yeah.
about the Church of England. I mean, if it was bad back then, look at how it is now.
Yeah. Yeah. I also find it humorous because one of the major issues that we would have with the Church of England, not saying that there aren't Anglicans that are true brothers, obviously, because that is true. But one
Yes.
of the issues we would have with the Anglican Church is you have a secular head as the secular ruler is head of the Anglican
Yes.
Church, and I
Yep.
find it very humorous that like in the case of James II, who's overtly Catholic, sometimes you'll have people that are not even of the same religion, the head of the church, and it's a different religion. Like
Right.
that's it's a it's a little bit of an indication that like something might not be right here. But um, were you? Oh yeah, you were done. We were moving on to my section. Yeah. So Cox would be imprisoned for about a year, and after his release, he would go back to serving at the church he was serving at prior to his arrest. And actually, John Bunyan was ordained pastor of the church that Cox was serving at in December of 1671. Then you have the Thomas Collier incident, we've talked about in past episodes. Um,
Hmm.
on the scene in the 1670s, and then the 1677 London Baptist Confession of Faith um, came out shortly after that in order to publicly distance themselves from the errors of Collier, especially given that he was from their ranks and spouting anti-Trinitarian heresy and other things. And he had made a name for himself among the particular Baptists initially. We also do see the particular Baptists involved in politics. This is interesting to note given the clear separation between the kingdom of Christ and the common kingdom as found in particular Baptist theology. So it's clear that despite the differences between particular Baptists and Presbyterians on the role of government in the church, that shouldn't be taken to mean that particular Baptists didn't believe that Christians couldn't be involved in politics at all, just as some of the Anabaptists had believed. Some of them were the Anabaptists of the Swiss regions, I believe that. Um, there was no, from the particular Baptist perspective, they didn't want a state established church or a sacralist mindset. Yet they did see themselves as citizens and social changers. And some used this to their advantage to help stop persecution. There was a movement to stop the persecution of Baptists in New England, and Kiffin, Cox, and others were involved in trying to stop the Congregationalists from creating hardships for the brethren. Um, uh, they wrote this as found in Renahan's Petty France Church, Part 1, and this is page 173. It seems strange that such was the same way in New England, yea, even such who chose rather, who chose rather, to depart from their native soil into a wilderness, then be under the imposition and lash of those who, upon religious pretenses, took delight to smite their fellow servants, should exercise towards other the like severity that themselves, with so great hazard and hardship, sought to avoid. So, in other words, the Congregationalists sought to avoid persecution in England, and so they left and went to New England. And now they're persecuting Christians who differ from them, and they felt that this was hypocritical, especially because it was about liberty of conscience issues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in 1685, we see the rise of James II, since Charles II passed away. James in 1687 ended all nonconformist punishment, and Nehemiah Cox expressed thanks to the king. It did seem from what I had read that James might have been doing this more as a way of getting persecution against Roman Catholics to stop. That he was doing this for everybody essentially, but regardless, it was done for everybody. Then there was the campaign to pack Parliament with MPs who were favorable to the king's agenda, and Nehemiah Cox was among the regulators who helped with this endeavor, essentially working with the king. And in 1689, the Act of Toleration was passed, giving religious freedoms to dissenting groups, but they could not serve in office. So, moving to the last slide. All right. So what are some lessons that we might learn from here? The first one might be put not your trust in princes, and I'll quote the verse here. This is Psalm 146 verses 3 through 5. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help, but breath goeth forth. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to the earth. In that very day his thoughts perish. Happy is he that hath the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God. So even if you do have a good period under Oliver Cromwell, right? That's immediately followed by religious persecution of a sort that seems to be worse than what came before. So regardless, like, oh well, we have a good king now, we're all good. That's not necessarily the case. What God gives, he can take away. It's ultimately his purposes, and it might be better for the sanctification of his church to not have a good king over them. We should also expect. Oh, did you have any thoughts about that?
No, that's just a really good point that we shouldn't expect a Christian king or a Christian ruler. We should just serve God where we are, whatever king or emperor or president or whatever the case might be where he has us, and continue to be good witnesses for the Lord. As you know, we're teaching through those of you who don't go to our church that are listening. We're going through the book of Daniel right now, and I'll be teaching on Daniel 6 tomorrow. But we see, like Daniel and his friends and the Jews are living under a pagan monarch, but they're serving God faithfully where they are. And Daniel wasn't trying to overthrow the king, this pagan king who clearly hated God. In multiple kings, not just Nebuchadnezzar. You have his son or successor Belshazzar, and then we're going to look at the Darius. But you see this, these lines of pagan kings, but Daniel continues to serve God where he's at. And I think you can kind of see that here at the Particular Baptist too, where even though they did try to enact social change legally, they weren't doing it by force. At least at least most of them were. Um, you do see them trying to use the means that they had to enact change to make their lives better so that they could worship God in the way that they saw without the hindrance of persecution. But at the same time, they still sought to obey God rather than men, regardless of who is in power. So that's a good point you bring up, Sean.
Yeah, and then the next point is although the level of persecution might wax and wane, Christians should be ready for it. And
Yes.
then I'll quote here First Peter verses 4, First Peter 4 verses 12 through 14. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though something strange, as so some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice inasmuch as you are partakers of Christ's suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. So, if you were to put yourself in the context of a particular Baptist living in the 17th century here, right? It might seem that like, well, what happened here? We actually had it good under Cromwell, and now we've got a king coming in that's doing these wicked things. Like, what's going on here? But the Bible says we should expect that, right? All that live a godly life in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Not that that persecution always looks the same. Not like every single Christian is always under the threat of death, but there's going to be some sort of persecution there. Um, so we shouldn't be surprised if fiery trials, and this would constitute at least one type of fiery trial, come upon them. Um, but that sort of thing produces perseverance and hope and demonstrates that we are who we say we are. Um,
Hmm.
so I think that's a good takeaway here. Um, the final takeaways, I guess, that I'll talk about is to don't turn around and support the persecution of other Christians. Because, and really, it's because the arm of the state can just as easily persecute others as yourself. With the Presbyterians, there's we could have a whole podcast episode on just what happened with the Presbyterians, how they were initially in power and trying to enforce the Reformed religion as they saw it, and then later they're actually the ones under persecution. Um, the arm of the state, it can just as easily persecute you as anyone else, right? It's like maybe it's because I'm politically more libertarian, but I'd rather just not even give the state that power in the first place, you know. Just it's not like what you give to them, they can easily turn around and take it out on you. And then you do have the example of the hypocrisy of the Congregationalists who fled um, England for liberty of conscience issues, and then the Baptists who are also Christian and had liberty of conscience issues. They're the ones that are persecuting them. You have the example of I think it was Obadiah Holmes, who's was tied up to a post and lashed for preaching Baptistic doctrine. So yeah, because it seems very hypocritical.
Yes, it is interesting when you see it, and you don't see. I mean, I guess you could argue that it was Christian against Christian, maybe in England, if you're assuming that there were Christians among the Anglicans.
Well,
But it was more. It seems to be more in New England, in the New World, that you see the persecution of Christian among Christian,
mhm.
which I find very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to see how Anglicans involved in the persecution of other Christians. Like, I mean, people sin, like people fall into grave sin. So I'm not
Yeah.
going to definitively say that they weren't
Yep.
Christian. People in the pews may not have necessarily been that way. But yeah, it does it raises your eyebrows sometimes when you hear about Christians and they're persecuting other Christians. Like you don't want to definitively say that they're not Christians, but like it's like, well, you're clearly not demonstrating it right now, at the very least.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. They may just have. People were men of their. They were men of their time. It was natural to, with the probably with the state church mindset integrated in your whole life, if there's something that disagrees from the majority, religiously speaking, maybe the natural response was just to persecute them without
Mhm,
stopping to say, wait a second, these are brothers in Christ. We need to slow down. And I think that's what you kind of see with Kiffin and others pointing out to the Congregationalists, like, look, slow down, guys. They're brothers. Why are you attacking them? You won't they're basically pulling the golden rule card, right? Do unto others you would have them do to you. You don't want the state persecuting you, so why are you persecuting your brothers? They're just trying to worship as they see fit. Stop picking on them. It's not biblical. You're being hypocritical here. And then you do see later on, and I think Renahan points this out in one of his books, is how the Baptists had an influence later in American life with the Constitution and establishing religious freedom. How they reached out to George Washington about religious freedom, and then lo and behold, you see in the Constitution this statement about religious freedom coming out. So you do see this starting to come on the scene later, this idea of religious freedom and toleration, but it seems that that state church mold just was really hard to break for people. So there is a sense where we can look back and criticize, and it's okay to do that. But at the same time, we also have to remember that these were men of their time, and that they were influenced by the world around them. Just because they were Christians doesn't mean that, or may have been Christians, doesn't mean that they had all of those things abolished and they're thinking like 21st century believers.
Hmm.
All right. Well, I think that's all we got for today. Brief history lesson. Hopefully, it's been helpful. Lots of resources out there on this stuff. Again, if you really want to deep dive into particular Baptist history, Sam Renahan's Petty France Church Parts 1 and 2, two different books. You can find them on Amazon. For the Vindication of the Truth, which is a brief exposition on the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. You can find history in Renahan's second one, To the Judicial and Impartial Reader. They're from Founders Press, and there's others out there that you can get on particular Baptist history. But there's a lot of recovery going on in recent years, and now on the history specifically surrounding particular Baptists. So there's a lot there we can pull from and learn. Like we're taking these applications and putting them on to Christians today and saying, how can we learn from how our forefathers acted or didn't act, or maybe should have been better at doing, or whatever the case might be. But there's a lot we can learn here. God has given us these things for us to learn from. And Bruce, good to see you, man. Glad it was helpful. Hopefully it's beneficial. Um, Hope you guys are doing well. But yeah, hopefully this has been beneficial, everyone. And we'll leave it at that. Lord willing, we'll have something out next week, and everyone have a great Lord's Day, and we'll talk to you soon.